with me when I first started to meet Kaosas people, and how they conceptualize themselves, and this really challenges the notion that First Nations people have passively accepted, the dominant discourse of the way in which to be Indian. Because what I found with Kaosas is that the kinship practices was historically and contemporary was much more inclusive and much more open to including people, whereas some communities are much more exclusive. They'll find ways to try and exclude people from being band members. Kaosas actually does different. They look at ways to try and include people. Again, this is historically based on the fact that it was a multicultural band made of Cree, Assiniboine, Saulteaux, and Métis and half-breeds primarily. Those are the main cultural groups of, and also the fact that they've also adopted in the post-reserve period. There's a number of white children who had been adopted by Kaosas people. So anyway, so what I see is that the way in which the Kaosas people practice their kinship historically has been able to be maintained to the present, and that the basis for that kinship practices is the stories of Elder Brother. Thanks.
And Charnine had asked if I wanted to come down and give a talk on the book I just published called Métis, and I had asked Rob if he wanted to come and speak with me, because Rob's book does a really good job of kind of critiquing the idea that there were these separate groups historically in all places and all times, First Nations here and Métis there. And of course, so Rob probably gave a talk where he basically said nothing about that aspect, so I'll try.
It's true. It's true.
I'll try and tie it together. Anyway, I'm Métis originally from. Well, I'm originally from a little town called Choiceland. Has anyone ever heard of Choiceland? Oh no way. Okay. Well, it's in Saskatchewan. It's about an hour east of Prince Albert. Family moved to Prince Albert when I was 8, 9, something like that. Yeah, in the early 80s, anyways. It was a long time ago, but. I went to Queen's University in Ontario to do my undergrad and my master's, and I originally went to Queen's to play football. I didn't even know it was a good university until I got there. And then I started taking courses, like, holy shit, this is really hard. And so I ended up quitting football, and my marks went up immediately after I quit football. And so I did my undergrad and I did my master's at Queen's University. And then my undergrad was on how bouncers maintain order in the bar. And then my master's degree was a logistic regression analysis of regional victimization rates in Canada. So why people tended to get beat up more as you went east to west in Canada, and why more houses got broken into as you went west to east in Canada. I don't remember what my conclusions were. I don't even remember being that interested in it when I was doing it. But my professor at the time was a guy named Vincent Sacco, who's really well known as a criminologist in Canada for doing this particular criminological theory called the criminal event, and I don't remember what it is anymore, but at the time I remember being really taken with it. And so I went to the University of Alberta to start my PhD, and that was in 1996, I think. Yeah. So I got there, I had a supervisor assigned to me. The supervisor and I didn't really get along that well, and so after a while I was thinking, well geez, I hope this guy's not going to be my supervisor for the next 4 to 6 years. And so sat down, had a conversation with them, because I was originally supposed to go to the University of Alberta to do research on looking at uniform crime report rates, so the information that cops take when they arrest people, to see if Aboriginal people were more likely to get stopped for various reasons, and then what were the circumstances surrounding that. So at the time, this will all make sense in a second, at the time I was taking these LISREL courses. Has anyone here ever heard of LISREL? It's linear structural equation modeling courses. It's like as kind of cutting edge as you could get with statistics. And the guy I was taking it from, the professor was considered one of the world's leading experts on these LISREL courses. So I took 2 of them. And the second one was worse than the first one. And I was like, I can't do a career on statistics. Like, this is killing me. Like, I can't do this. So at the same time, we had a cousin who got charged with poaching because he had shot a deer, and he was in a wheelchair. But he used to be a welder, so he had rigged up his van, so he had a gun rack in the van, and he could shoot deer out of the van, which we thought was a genius setup at the time. So he gets charged, and at the time, just as he was getting charged with this, the Powley case was coming into its kind of second iteration. Have you guys heard of the Powley case? It was a big Métis rights case. The Supreme Court decision came out in 2003, I think. But the original case was coming around 96, 97, something like that. It originally happened in 93, and then with all the pretrial stuff going on, it finally came into existence in 1997 when it went to court. And so I thought, what would be really interesting is to look at my cousin's case, look at the evidence, and kind of think about how the courts thought about what it meant to be Métis. But of course, being a young PhD student, and it was family, didn't want to screw it up because I didn't know how well I knew the theories and stuff, so I thought, well, I need a pigeon first. Powley case was a perfect pigeon for it, because if I screwed that up, I'm the only one embarrassed. I don't really know, kind of, nobody else in my family is embarrassed. So I said, okay, well, I'll look at the Powley decision. And so I looked at all the arguments that were involved in the Powley case. 2,500 pages of court testimony, another 2,000 pages of evidence, and 20 interveners who intervened into the case for various reasons. And so back in the mid-1990s, when I was doing my dissertation, the big thing back then, the big movement in law back then was critical race theory, right? Critical race theory started up in the 1980s, made its way into Canada in the 1990s. And the big thing to do with critical race theory was to demonstrate how the law was colonial. We take all this shit for granted now, but back into the 90s, this was big news, talking about the law as being something other than a neutral arbiter of various parties that come before it. And so I was all, this is all very exciting, and did all the readings on the American stuff. There wasn't a lot of Canadian stuff, but the stuff that there was pretty good. So put that all together, and I did the original first couple of chapters of my dissertation. The book is partially based on the dissertation. That's what all of my yakking so far has to do with the book. So I had done a couple of chapters, and then I got a hold of the Supreme Court intervenor factum. So in Canada, when you go to court at the Supreme Court of Canada, the main parties who are involved in the court case can make arguments before the court, but other people can gain standing because they say, hey, this court decision is going to have an effect on my organization, therefore I want to write to the court to try and persuade them one way or the other. And provinces, the attorney generals for the provinces, attorneys general for the provinces, almost always put in what are called intervenor factums. But other people do as well. So Métis organizations put them in, et cetera, et cetera. So after I had this idea that, yeah, well, this is clearly a colonial decision. The court case is based on the idea that in order to be Métis, you have to prove that your ancestors did things hundreds of years ago, right? And that seemed really kind of dumb in the sense that, could you imagine if Canadian rights were based on what Canadians had done 150 years ago, right? People wouldn't stand for that. That's ridiculous. But in an Aboriginal context, that's par for the course. In order to demonstrate the authenticity of what you're doing now, you have to demonstrate that your ancestors engaged in analogous behaviors back then. I thought, well, this is easy peasy. I'm going to knock this out in the next 4 months. Then I read the intervenor factums, and more important, I read the Powley team's own argument. Because this argument I was getting at the beginning was what the court had written in the final Supreme Court decision. And then I looked at the, sorry, it wasn't the Supreme Court decision, it was the the Court of Appeal decision in Ontario. Very clearly colonial in the way that we kind of thought about colonialism back then. So then I read the Powley team's argument before the court, right? So the Powleys, who were charged with hunting a moose out of season and without a tag, had hired Jean Taillé and a couple of other people to take their court case for them. And when I looked at their argument, it completely shifted my whole perspective, because the Superior Court decision and eventually the Supreme Court decision was almost a cut and paste argument of the Powleys legal team's argument. So how could we stand there and talk about how colonial the courts were without talking about the ways in which, as Indigenous peoples, we invested ourselves in those discourses, in those practices, and in those institutions, reproducing the legitimacy of those institutions, no matter what the actual content of the court decisions were. So I thought, oh, geez, I didn't say that. I said something similar, though. And I thought, well, what am I going to do now? So I sat down with my supervisor. And my supervisor was doing research around assisted suicide and the court cases involved in assisted suicide. And I said, well, my dissertation is kaput. I'm done. You know, I was doing a whole kind of woe is me thing. And she said, no. Nothing is wrong with what you found. You just have to figure out a way, theoretically, to think through what you found. And I said, yeah, but I'm stuck. Like, I don't really know. Critical race theory isn't really built for talking about the internal complexity of decisions. Critical race theory almost always looks at court decisions. It doesn't look at court cases. And when you're only looking at the court decisions, you're only getting the tip of the iceberg, the arguments that actually basically won the day, as opposed to other arguments that were involved in the context of that court case. And she said, okay, well, you're going to have to invent a new vocabulary for thinking and talking about what it means to look at court cases rather than court decisions. Which, of course, I'd never signed up for that. I was like, you know, when you're in a PhD, it's kind of learned by numbers, right? So you basically have a supervisor who says, well, I think you should do this. And then, oh, that sounds pretty cool. And you kind of work your way along it. And as you paint the different numbers in, you have this picture at the end. But suddenly this thing had completely blown open. Now, while all of that was happening, on the one hand, in terms of my existential crisis about what the dissertation was going to be about, I had applied for a job in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. And I thought, well, there's no way I'm going to get the job because there's people out there with, you know, actual publications and what have you. But I just want to practice kind of so that when I do look for a job in the future, I know something about what the interview process is like. But as luck would have it, there was two fairly well-known people who applied for the job. Half of the committee couldn't stand one. The other half of the committee couldn't stand the other. And so I came right up through the middle. And mediocrity won the day. And suddenly, to everybody's surprise, including my own, I got offered this job to start teaching in Native Studies, which I was completely and wholly unprepared for. So then, because of the way Native Studies was structured back then, they said, so listen, they didn't say it, but we don't really care how much research you do. We really hired you to teach. And so over the next 3 years, I taught 4, 5, and 5, so 14 courses, 9 different courses out of the 14. So I had to do 9 new preps over 3 years. So suffice it to say, I didn't get anything done on my dissertation for the next 3 years. And interestingly, when I got hired, there was nothing in my job description that said I had to get a PhD. It said a PhD is preferred, but you only need a master's. And so I was going to ride that sucker right into the grave. But then someone pointed out to me, yeah, but you're probably going to have to get your PhD in order to get tenure. And I said, tenure? What's that? So then we had a discussion, and so then I thought, okay, well, probably a good idea then for me to finish my PhD. So as I was teaching in Indigenous Studies, and I was teaching a lot of courses either that were